But Jackson's management of things at the south end of the field were not his best moment. And then, that night, he wants to launch a counterattack from this same part, the northern flank of the swamp, across this same field. And he has his men tie white handkerchiefs across their arms so they can see each other in the dark and be able to identify each other. And as soon as they get out there, federal artillery just opens up on them and chases them back. Attack doesn't last very long at all. Lee told him, don't counterattack, because if you do, you'll get out there, and that artillery will blast you off the field, which is exactly what happens. So Fredericksburg is not really a great time for Stonewall Jackson. But people are like, oh, look, Stonewall Jackson. There's a monument on the south end of the field that marks the position just because he was there. It says Jackson on the field. I don't know about you guys. Any of you have a monument that just says, I was here? But that's the sort of persona that Jackson begins to sort of assume, not for any reason of his own. That's the sort of persona that Jackson begins to assume after that event. So here we are. But in downtown Fredericksburg, there's also a monument put up by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And it says, General Stonewall Jackson, by General Lee's request, on this corner, planned the Battle of Fredericksburg, November 27, 1862. And I always like to use this monument as an excuse for people like, oh, you shouldn't tear down monuments. You shouldn't do anything to monuments. This is a monument that has every fact wrong. Should we leave it up just because it's a monument? It has every fact wrong. On November 27th, he's still somewhere around Orange Courthouse on his way from the Shenandoah Valley just a couple days after he almost arrested Jewel Early. It's around this time that he found out that he was going to be a dad for the first time. And he's not in downtown Fredericksburg. He never sets foot ever in downtown Fredericksburg, let alone sitting on a street corner with Robert E. Lee saying, well, what do you think we should do for this battle? How about it? And if you don't know anything about the Battle of Fredericksburg, it's entirely reactive on Lee's part. He puts half of his army on the hills just behind the city, and then he's going to wait to see what Ambrose Burnside does before he can deploy the rest of his army. It's an entirely reactive battle on Lee's part. But again, because he's Stonewall Jackson, look at this amazing stuff. He can defy facts. He's so good. Okay? So, how about Cedar Mountain? August 9th, 1862, its first time against Nathaniel Banks. He actually wins this battle. It's often considered the first battle of the Second Manassas Campaign, but it can also be considered the final battle of 7 days, even though it's a month after the end of the 7 days. Because as Lee is looking at George McClellan outside of Richmond, we've got John Pope's army trying to kind of sneak up around behind it. And so Jackson gets dispatched out toward Culpeper County, where they fight at Cedar Mountain, which is now a state park. And Jackson's able to defeat the lead elements of Pope's army and drive them backwards. But it doesn't go well, and Jackson almost loses. Now, if we know anything about Nathaniel Banks, we know he's not an A-lister for the Federal Army. Jackson has already beaten him during the Valley Campaign, where Banks gave up so many supplies, he became known as Commissary Banks. But he's an influential politician, and so he has this position. Lincoln kind of has to keep him in the game. And Banks almost wins this battle. And as his men are kind of breaking through, Jackson rides to the front in the midst of this breakthrough, and he tries to lead his men in a counterattack, pulling out his sword, which has rusted into its scabbard. So he has to pull the scabbard and all out and go, Jackson is with you! And he leads his men on this counterattack. I love this painting. It's a Don Trioni painting. If you look real close, Jackson just has this crazed look in his eyes. His temper's gone. His wispy hair is flying to the back. Then he's waving his rusty sword in the air. It's a fantastic moment of high drama. And this is how we think of Cedar Mountain, which he almost loses to Nathaniel Banks. But his men do rally. They do successfully counterattack. They do drive Banks off the field. It is a victory. And then Jackson leaves. So he gives up the ground that he just won. It goes back to rejoining his army to kick off the Second Manassas campaign. So it's a win, but it's not like an A+ win. So we think of Banks. Well, there he is. Doesn't he just look like a fighter? Go get him, Tiger. How about Antietam? All right, I had to work this in some way. All right, I gave it to the Antietam Institute, right? Okay, but no, I'm in Antietam. Here we're really starting to see good, solid fighting. He's at the north end of the field. Joe Hooker's men, First Corps go in. There's a lot of back and forth fighting. Pennsylvania Reserves get sent in there. We got Sedgwick coming in through the West Woods. Jackson is just feeding guys in desperate fashion in this checkerboard battle that is absolutely desperate. And you guys have probably heard that great quote from Joe Hooker where it said that it looked like his men were cut down in rows as if by a knife. The corn stalks themselves. It is desperate fighting. And Jackson not only holds his own, he does get driven back eventually until he's around the Duncan Church. He wins because he finally sends in John Bell Hood's Texans, who had just settled down to finally eat breakfast. And Jackson's like, you don't have time to eat, go. And so you got angry Texans running into the battle. Of course they're hangry. Of course they're going to win, right? And that finally sort of blunts the fighting there at the north end of the field. At terrible, terrible cost to everyone involved, Texans included. John Bell Hood afterwards says his division is dead in the field. It is desperate fighting. I keep using that term, desperate. But Jackson manages it well. From a command point of view, as things are thin on his line, had George McClellan attacked all along the line, and Jackson couldn't peel off reinforcements to help him, maybe things would have turned out a lot differently. But Jackson was able to manage things on his front, the troops available, and the reinforcements as he could get. I give him high marks for Antietam. Okay? And then fighting will shift away from his front toward the middle of the line in D.H. Hill's position in the Sunday Road. Okay? Chancellorsville. My front yard, literally. I sit at my desk and I look out the window. Edward Porter Alexander had artillery set up in what is now my front yard on the first day of the battle. Love this battlefield. And we all know Jackson is able to march up the field, meet Hooker, stop Hooker in his tracks, force Hooker to take a defensive position around the Chancellorsville intersection, and then as he sits down with Robert E. Lee, looking at the map, figuring out what to do next, he comes up with this bold plan to march all the way off the map and circle up to the west and get into the flank of the Federal position and then roll up the Federal line. Boom, 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 catching poor Oliver Howard by surprise, driving up, setting these guys pell-mell in retreat. We look at Jackson's flank attack as one of the great achievements of the war, leading to Robert E. Lee's victory by the end of the battle over forces that outnumber the Confederates by more than 2-1. Historians have called this Lee's greatest victory. All plotted out as Lee and Jackson sat on a pair of cracker boxes, looking at that map and figuring this out. It's a stunning achievement. Except Jackson gets shot and dies a few days later. I don't know if we can count this as his greatest hit, because he's dead at the end of it. Okay? I always liken this to being his Jimi Hendrix moment. He dies at the peak of his powers. Okay? Achieves his greatest thing on the battlefield. But I also, so he never has the chance to like grow old and become Fat Elvis, right? He is at the peak of his powers. But I contend that Jackson's wounding at Chancellorsville is the best thing that happened to Lee during the battle. Because at that moment, as Jackson's portion of the army is over here, and Robert E. Lee's portion of the army is over here, in the middle is a big, angry, wounded Union army that could turn and crush Jackson if it wanted to, or turn and crush Lee if it wanted to. The Confederate Army is dangerously divided at this moment. And it's only when Jeb Stuart comes onto the field, recognizing the precariousness of this position, that he communicates with Lee, and they decide they're going to link up and then try to put the squeeze on Hooker that way. But if Jackson had stayed in the game, he told A.P. Hill, one of his division commanders, to press the attack, press them, Hill. Cut them off from United States Ford. Press them. That's a change in his plan. Instead of just driving down the Plank Road, going toward the Chancellorsville intersection, he wants to cut them off from their escape route at the Ford. Right? So if he drives in this direction with A.P. Hill's 10,000 exhausted men who have just marched 13 miles and come onto the battlefield in the dark, in confusion, let's send them up here. You know who's up here? George Gordon Meade's 5th Corps, which has been uncommitted. So we've got at least 22,000 guys, and we've got John Reynolds' 1st Corps coming onto the battlefield. They haven't been fighting it either. Now, I'm a writer. Nobody said there'd be math involved. But 10,000 exhausted Confederates against nearly 45,000 fresh federal troops commanded by the Union Army's 2 best Corps commanders. I don't know that math adds up very well. Right? What if Jackson just continues on with his original plan? Just goes straight to Chancellorsville? Well, he's got the 3rd Corps on both sides of him, the 12th Corps over here, and then he still has the 5th Corps and the 1st Corps. He's going right into the teeth of the tiger then. I just don't see how Chancellorsville works out very well for the Confederates if Jackson stays on the battlefield. So his wounding at that moment forces Lee to change his overall plan, leading to victory that next morning. So, it may be his most famous thing that he's done in the war. It's a pretty remarkable achievement to get over there and does what he does. But I don't think the follow-through, especially because he ends up dead, is all that great. Very slow to go. Oh yeah, let's see, he ends up dead. There we go. There we go. So for those of you who've never been to First Manassas, there we go. It's Ares, the god of war. Joseph Puglia, the sculptor, is an Italian. This is put up in sort of like in the late 30s. So, Europe is at war. America's looking for heroes. We're not in the war yet, but we're sort of looking for a way to kind of express our military might. So we get this really romanticized version of Jackson.